Hi, my name's Natalia, and I'm a sophomore in the engineering school. Thank you to Cheryl, Dorsey, and Governor Deval Patrick for coming to StartupColumbia and for participating in our next panel, Solving for Impact. We are so excited to have you here and even more excited to learn from you. Cheryl is the president of Echoing Green, a social impact organization that seeds talent to solve the world's most pressing problems. Cheryl has been a pioneer in the social entrepreneurship movement, and we are honored to have you here. Governor Deval Patrick is the managing director of Bain Capital Double Impact. Prior to that, he was the governor of my home state, Massachusetts, for 2 terms from 2007 to 2015. Fun fact, they both worked in the Clinton administration, and Cheryl has 3 degrees from Harvard, and Governor Deval Patrick has 2. Even more importantly, even more importantly, they're both using their positions to truly give back to communities and make the world a better place for us all. Thank you both for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so thrilled to have this opportunity to have a conversation. Thank you. Have the conversation with the governor and with all of you. I just think it's important when you've got leadership, tri-sector leadership, like Governor Deval Patrick, that we have an opportunity to be in conversation with him. So after the governor and I talk for about 25 minutes, we will open it up for a Q&A.
Great.
Because I think we have a wonderful opportunity.
I want to point out, though, she threw the tri-sector thing my way to make up for the fact that she has more degrees than I do. 3 in your case. Cheryl is a doctor first, I think, right?
True, pediatrician. Right. Yep.
Yes. So we'll get to talk about your journey to what you're doing and why you have hipper music in your video than I do.
Right.
Yeah.
But yours pretty extraordinary. And I've actually known of Governor Patrick for many years and had the opportunity to spend some more time with him about 2 years ago, and have thus been following your incredible career in public service and social justice, and now business for many years. I think that leadership by example is a really powerful signal. So can we start, will you please tell us a little bit about your journey starting on the south side of Chicago to what led you to Bain today, Governor?
Wow. Are we supposed to get to Q&A eventually? So I grew up, as you noted, Cheryl, on the south side of Chicago. Anybody here from Chicago? Some of you know this house. So not the garden spot. And I lived there with my mother, my sister, my grandparents, and various relatives who came and went in our grandparents' 2-bedroom tenement, some of that time on welfare. I remember my mother and sister and I used to share one of those bedrooms in a set of bunk beds. So you go from the top bunk to the bottom bunk to the floor every 3rd night on the floor. But, you know, we had a very strong sense of community. And even in those big broken schools, we had terrific teachers who taught us how to look up and not down, and taught us that as you climb, you lift, which is this whole notion of generational responsibility. I had an opportunity through a program called A Better Chance to go to an independent school in Boston. Milton Academy, yep. Which was like landing on a different planet. And then went on to Harvard, the first in my family to go to college. And then I lived in Africa, and then I came back to law school at Harvard. And then I left the East Coast for good, I thought, and moved to California and clerked for a judge, and met there the woman who is now my wife, 35 years in May. Oh. And she's from New York, and we moved back to New York. So I've been, and there I joined the Legal Defense Fund. So I've been a civil rights lawyer. I have been a lawyer in a big firm. I have served in the Clinton administration as head of the Civil Rights Division in the first term, and then back in private practice. I've served as an executive in 2 Fortune 50 companies. And at a point, you know, a little while ago, decided that I wanted to try my hand at elective office and ran for governor, which is the only thing I've run for. And then promptly the bottom fell out of the global economy, so we had a lot of work to do. And you have had an amazing journey, which I hope you'll talk about as well. I mentioned that you've been a doctor, but your journey started before that.
Indeed. Indeed. And I want to fill in the blanks. And again, I have the bit of luxury of having followed Governor Patrick's career, you having worked at both Coca-Cola and Texaco, and worked in the Clinton administration, and then the first African-American governor of Massachusetts, and served 2 terms, and brought full coverage of healthcare to the state. Will you, at Echoing Green, we talk about sort of the driving force, the why do you do what you do, or the moment of obligation. Can you point to a particular experience or belief or pull that has led you to this incredible life of service, Governor Patrick?
First of all, I don't want to leave out the place of good luck, good fortune, and blessings, because my life has zigged and zagged. Yeah. Sometimes people come and ask me, I want to be a governor one day. Tell me about your path. How do I plan that? And I say, well, actually, I didn't plan it exactly that way. I think there are lots of different ways to serve, and I think that there was can I tell a story maybe that captures?
Yes, please.
When I was, I think, 15 or 16 years old, Cheryl, I went home to Chicago on a school vacation, and I was late to meet somebody, and I went running to catch the bus to make this appointment, and I got on the bus. This old wheezing Chicago CTA bus, and I stood there at the coin box. They used to have coin boxes. Most of you don't know what I'm talking about. And I realized only when I got on that I didn't have enough money for the fare. And there was this old black guy with sort of grizzled beard who was driving, and and the bus was already moving. And he pointed to the seat closest to the door, and he says, "Sit down, son." And I knew I was going to get it. And I started to explain to him I was in a hurry. I'd been away. The fare had changed. I wasn't trying to beat the CTA out of their fare. And he turned from the road and looked me over. And he sized me up instantly the way people who serve the public can do. And he turned back to the road, and his expression softened, and he said, "Just pass it on, son."
Wow.
And it was an act of grace. It's a tiny thing, insignificant maybe to most of you, but it is the kind of thing, and I've had a couple of other experiences like that just made me want to be a better man. And it sort of put in that and other similar kinds of encounters, put in relief some of the lessons I learned from those teachers on the south side of Chicago, from my grandparents, from other mentors I had, that, whatever you do, you don't leave your conscience at the door. That's right. You bring that to bear in your work, and I know that's been true of you, and I hope you'll talk about that.
I will talk briefly about it, and then hopefully that'll lead to the next question I want to ask about your gubernatorial run and then tenure. Well, again, I'm president of Echoing Green. We are a global social impact fund. Essentially, we're angel investors in the social sector, and it's our job to go out into the world and tell young leaders, next-gen leaders about the Echoing Green Fellowship. And if you've got an innovative idea, disruptive idea to make your community better, apply to Echoing Green. Yeah. And we have an annual process. Every year, we make up to 30 investments. And we were founded about 32 years ago by the senior leadership of General Atlantic. Yep. So a private equity firm that really, they're true pioneers in the field of social entrepreneurship. And back in the day, I was actually in grad school at Harvard. I was at the medical school, had taken a year off to get a master's from the Kennedy School, and had read an article in the Boston Globe. And again, I'm so old school, like reading above the fold, below the fold, not reading on my phone, but reading the edition of Boston Globe. And there was a 5-part series called Birth in the Death Zones. And it was tracking Boston's unfortunate accolade of having the 3rd highest infant mortality rate disparity between black and white babies, meaning that black babies were 3 times as likely to die before their first birthday than white infants, which is inequitable and horrific enough, but in the shadow of some of the world's greatest medical facilities. Walking distance, Governor. Brigham and Women's, Mass General, is just atrocious. Yep. And, for me, that moment of obligation, I still see the grainy picture from the top of the Boston Globe, of a young young woman who could have been my sister, looked a lot like me, could have been my cousin, kneeling before the grave of the baby she had just buried. And again, it just became my obligation to not look away and decide what to do about it, if anything. And happened to have a relationship with an incredible obstetric anesthesiologist, African-American woman who just retired as Dean of Students at Harvard Medical School, Nancy Oriol. And we just kept asking why. And what can we do? And ultimately started a mobile health unit that connected Boston residents who needed services into existing medical facilities. At the time, there wasn't a lot of talk about cultural competency or access to care, but that's what we were doing back in the day. And here was this newfangled fellowship program called Echoing Green that took a chance on me and really believed in me before I believed in myself. So really a transformative process. But
you have mentored so many people who've come into the field, including me. How has that conversation changed for you? How has your advice to folks coming into impact investing changed over the years, if at all?
If at all. So again, I'm excited to have everyone hear about what you are running with Bain Double Impact. But Echoing Green, again, has been around for 32 years. Most of us who got involved with Echoing Green were starting social justice organizations, education reform organizations. So founders like Wendy Kopp from Teach for America, Alan Casey and Michael Brown of City Year, Vanessa Kirsch and Michelle Obama from Public Allies, Van Jones. Most folks know Van from CNN, but when Van graduated from law school in 1995, he went back to Oakland and started Bay Area Police Watch, which at the time was the country's first hotline to report police abuse. This was before Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, before his Green Jobs work. And so it was really in the business of identifying essentially social justice leaders who were attempting to be disruptive and shift paradigms within a particular space. But about a decade ago, we started noticing all of these young folks who really had raised their hand and said, there's not enough philanthropic capital to solve our social problems at scale. And until we tap into the capital markets and start to really blur these sectoral boundaries, we're not going to get there. So in 2006, we noted that 15% of our applicant pool were proposing for-profit or hybrid enterprises. It's now 50% of our applicant pool.
How about that?
So a new day.
Yep.
And I know that's in part what led you to launch and run Bain Double Impact. And I would love to hear more about what you're seeing, the kinds of deals you're investing in, and why you think this is a good lever for driving progress.
Well, I guess my motivations had to do with one. For a long time, and I say this as someone who has been in the private sector has been on the sidelines, meaning, a lot of folks think, and a lot of people in business think or thought, that it was up to government and the philanthropic sector to deal with issues of social and economic justice, frequently the consequences of the private sector. And I think more and more entrepreneurs, more and more business leaders are understanding they have a role to play too, and more customers and consumers and citizens are insisting that business step up, and that's a really good thing. And when I say step up, I don't mean, we were talking about this a little bit backstage, I don't mean that thing you sometimes get from business people like you. I used to see this in my old job in education, where business kind of comes along and says, you know what, we'll take it from here. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the power of collaboration, the power of having all these different players from all these different sectors bear down on how to address challenges that frankly are too big for any one sector to deal with. So in our little way, in our fund, we are trying to be a capital source for companies like that are mission-oriented, that are already growing but need capital to scale. And what we found in developing the business plan is that there were an awful lot of entrepreneurs who could attract that capital because their company was growing, but not necessarily that partner that was interested in growing the impact or the mission-oriented side of their business alongside the commercial. So we're investing in companies, lower middle market companies, all in North America, where we can show a competitive rate of return, and there are reasons for that. It's not a value judgment on where other people are, but where we are, and measurable impact in the areas of sustainability, health and wellness, and what we call community building. And an example recently we were talking about backstage is a company called Rural Sourcing, which is an IT outsourcing company that is taking advantage of the trend toward onshoring outsourcing. So, for a long time, IT needs were sent out of the country. More of that is coming onshore, and this company was organized to create hubs in, frankly, hollowed out downtowns of small towns that are tech hubs. So there are 5 so far, Mobile, Fort Wayne, Indiana, for example, where about 150 tech jobs are made available, blue chip work, great income and benefits, and catalyzing economic revival in some cities that have been overlooked.
So 2 follow-up questions. So one, I don't think I knew much about Bain as a company until Mitt Romney became governor and then ran for president, and heard about his work founding this extraordinary company. But I'm curious if you could maybe pull back the curtain for us. Like, what was that conversation like for a behemoth like Bain to get into the space? I mean, enshrined in sort of corporate bylaws, it's about optimizing shareholder value, not stakeholder value, shareholder value. What's the journey for a company like Bain to get into this space?
It's interesting you say this, because I think it took, I knew some of the senior people at Bain Capital, and have for a long time. Place is crawling with Democrats. This is off the record, right? And when I was thinking about what I wanted to do next, I got talking with some of them, and it turns out that they had been trying to figure out how to get into impact investing for a while, because, as you know, this is an industry that's quite mature in Europe, less so here. And some of the investors in other funds from Europe had been asking the firm about it. So they said, why don't you come in and help us figure it out? I will say that this notion of maximizing investor return or shareholder return has been corrupted, I think, over time in the rhetoric. It's not actually what the coiner of that phrase was talking about. It's not just about money. And I think if you actually believe in long-term value, not the next quarter's return, but long-term value, especially at a time of ubiquitous information, it's impossible to manage to a financial bottom line alone. You can try, but if you mess up with people or the planet, that will come around to bite your financial bottom line. For me, it's not that big a leap from there to impact investing, which is about being intentional about those other bottom lines, and folks got that.
And can you talk a little bit, there's a lot of discussion now around sort of, well, then how do you measure impact? And whether it's like IMM, impact multiple of money, which is the rubric that the RISE fund uses, that was developed by Bridgespan, or you've got sort of the whole certification process through B corporations and B Lab. How do you all measure and talk about the impact?
Yeah, I think this is the area where there's been the most debate, and where there still has to be a lot of debate and work. I think what Bridgespan and TPG Rise did was a big step forward. When we were talking to potential investors, folks said to us, "Look, we basically 2 takeaways. One is, don't invent a measure of your own." They said, use something in general usage if you can, so that we can compare your performance on impact with other impact funds. That's the reason we didn't create our own, unique measure. And the other was, be careful not to turn your companies into reporting agencies. Have just a few factors that are material that managers can manage to. Measure those, roll it up as a fund, and report out. So we are using the GEARS survey from B Lab, which is adaptable to those 2 objectives. I will say that our LPs, our investors who are on this journey with us, have lots and lots of other questions, many unique to their own constituency. If it's, for example, a public pension fund, so they want stories, they want other information, and we've been working hard to answer those needs. But we use GEARS to create an impact blueprint for each company. We set a goal. We do a measure when we go in. We set goals for where we're going, and and frankly, managers, operational managers, compensation depends on their progress toward that. In part, on their progress toward those goals, and then you can roll it up and report it out fund-wide as well.
That's so interesting. So I want to switch gears a little bit before we start to think about questions. So, you know, at Echoing Green, we're an incredibly diverse community of social entrepreneurs. And again, social impact first. We've got a diverse community in terms of where people are working around the world, what they're working on, whether they're for-profit, nonprofit, or hybrid. But again, all social impact first. But another commonality that we see that is just heartbreaking to us is sort of this lack of access to capital, especially if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you are a proximate leader. And again, we get 2,500, 2,600 business plan submissions a year. So we can track what these disparities look like. And by the time you're a finalist for the Echoing Green Fellowship, you're so darn good. It's just we don't have enough money to invest in you. Sure. But year on year, we see things like, you know, the average male applicant will have raised about 120K versus, you know, 90K for the women. You know, the median amount of money raised by finalists for Echoing Green's Black Male Achievement Fellowship, not all African-American male founders, but most of them are, the median amount they've raised is $0 versus $100,000 for our climate innovators who are overwhelmingly white men. Yep. So the disparities are stark and we're just stuck in it. Can you talk a little bit about this very difficult subject around lack of access to capital for diverse entrepreneurs?
Well, you know, I'm going to ask you to take the question because, no, it's a serious, serious problem. It's very interesting to me how many of the books we get, the pitch decks and so on from founders are from Black and brown founders and women who feel that, you know, they can kind of squint and get past the Bain Capital part. And they see that we have the most diverse team in this space and at the firm, and they feel like it's a place where they can, you know, get a fair shot. Frankly, we get more early pitches than you know, early stage companies than we do, because, you know, than we can possibly do, because frankly that's not what we do. We do later stage. Most impact investors, as you know, are startups and other early stage. And one of the hardest things is figuring out where to send them, because we're trying not to just say no. It's more not yet, or try this, or let us introduce you to somebody else. It takes a tremendous amount of time, but that is what you laid out is a huge part. And of course, it has a history. You know, it comes from a place. How do you guys manage?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and again, it's sort of, you know, the implicit and explicit bias that lives in all of these systems. I mean, even for, you know, Echoing Green, which is by far the most diverse community of social entrepreneurs, a couple of years ago in our sourcing and selection process, we actually instituted some blind screening rounds. Yeah. I mean, even that increased the diversity of our portfolio even more. We also, when you sort of look at a lot of the literature, you know, there's interesting studies that sort of the implicit bias in decision making is more to do with your pedigree, where you went to school, who you know, versus the quality or caliber of the entrepreneur. So we're trying to wring that from our system. I think increasingly it is about building relational trust across these funds to the point where somebody can pick up the phone, and if I can call the folks at the Rise Fund and say, hey, you got to look at this extraordinary young woman who's got this incredible company, talk to her. Yes. So how do you use that social capital currency to break down some of those implicit biases?
Well, and one of the things I have found, and we talked about this when you and I talked during our sort of formative thinking, this field is very generous. It's very open. People share a lot of information about what they have learned and what's gone wrong and right and who they know, and they pass you on to the next person who has insights. And I think it's one of the most exciting things about what's happening here. I hope that culture continues as the field explodes.
I want to ask one more question before we open it up. And again, given your deep work in policy and politics, I've been fascinated by the passage of probably the most seismic economic development opportunity in generations, the opportunity zone legislation. And I'm fascinated because I'm both scared and skeptical, but also maybe a tiny bit hopeful.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your impression of opportunity zones and both the potential pitfalls, but also the opportunity, if you see any there?
Well, I'm encouraged. I think my feelings are a little bit like yours. You know, there was a lot left to regulatory clarification, and the first set of regs, as you know, confirmed a sense we had that it was mainly about place, about real estate, and so you know, it's not really an emphasis of ours because we're not investing in real estate. There is provision for operating companies in that real estate, and we do operating companies, so we're interested in that. But right now, the regs make it so that a large percentage of the revenue, not just the jobs, but the revenue generated by a business in an opportunity zone has to come from that opportunity zone. So if you are, if you're making, you know, if we bought a company and we said there's a better location for it, let's put it in an opportunity zone, then a large portion of the sales or the revenue generated by that company, you know, it might come from all over the country, but to qualify for the opportunity zone benefits, they have to come from the opportunity zone. That is a blind spot, I think. And then the other thing I'm worried about is that, you know, at the end of the day, the direct benefits come to investors, right? The people who and the institutions who invest in a fund like mine. And you know, that is fine. That's fine. But it's not enough. That's all I'm trying to say.
That's exactly right. Less impact can generate high returns. So bottom line is, how do you think about your IPS in terms of balancing the act of generating competitive return and social good? The other part is more put it into quantitatively or qualitatively. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So say your first name. Henry?
Yep.
So it's a great question. I said that in our case, this is not true across the board. In our case, we chose a place on the spectrum of financial returns, which was a PE-style return. And the reason for that is not a value judgment on where others choose to be on that spectrum, because there's room on the spectrum, but because institutionally, at our firm, the sort of investors in funds like ours expect a PE return. Personally, I want to be able to demonstrate that you don't have to, at scale, that you don't have to trade return for impact, because I think if we do that repeatedly at scale, there's some unavoidable questions for investing generally. That's just an ambition of mine. We have chosen the areas we have and not others, because there were opportunities we could identify where we could, in fact, have a fair chance of delivering a PE-style return. So, for example, affordable housing, huge impact, but it's hard to get a PE return. So we're not doing affordable housing. Doesn't mean that it isn't worthy. It's just in narrowing down what our focus was, we narrowed to the kinds of businesses where we felt, and the sector of the market where we felt we could deliver a private equity return. And then the last thing I will say is that most of the businesses we invest in are, the impact is inherent. So, you know, we invested in a company in Texas that diverts green waste from landfills where it would otherwise break down and create greenhouse gases, and instead composts it and sells it as composted soil and top dressing. You know, that business, we can measure the greenhouse gas emissions avoided. That's what that business is about. And so as the business gets bigger, we do more of that. We also can measure an improvement or our contribution in eliminating or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. That make sense?
Absolutely. Any thoughts, Ms.
We're different, and then again, we're a social impact first investor, so we do not at all take into account financial return on investment when we invest in these very early stage social entrepreneurs. And in fact, we're backing leaders. We believe that transformational leadership is a powerful lever for transformative change. So we don't even think about it. And the reason we ended up sort of falling into impact investing is literally because we were trying to help our social entrepreneurs just build these capital stacks by any means necessary. What did they need to get to the point where they could get across the valley of death that all these early stage social entrepreneurs face? So again, we didn't intentionally start to play in this space, but whether it's philanthropic capital, working capital, debt, or equity, we're just trying to figure out how to break open this access to capital question.
Thank you.
So you were both talking about when you're investing for impact, you need to look at the measures, but that can be hard to do, and you want to make sure that you're not falling into the role of a reporting agency. So when you look at things like social impact investing that's like outcomes based, how do you balance that, and what are the implications going forward for this area for seeing not only what the returns are like at a PE level, but also what the social impact returns are for those who are stakeholders or shareholders in this process?
Let me take that. So ours, say your first name.
Devine.
Demeen?
Devine, yes. D-V-E-N.
With a B?
No, with a D, like David.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
This will happen to you one day. So ours is a we're only investing in private companies. They're not public companies, publicly traded. Although there's a lot of activity. Impact investing activity in the public markets. That is not what we do. What we do and to whom we report in our measurement are our investors and the ownership team, and frankly the whole family in the company we're investing in. When I say the whole family, I mean all of the employees and the relationships they have. There are things that we do in every company that are not necessarily why we invested in the company. So issues around compensation levels and sort of scrubbing the workforce for inequities in compensation and benefits, and doing benchmarking to see that the company isn't trailing competitors in the industry. We look at the sustainability of the supply chain, if that is applicable in every company. We look at things like whether they're using these in the office versus a more energy efficient and environmentally sensitive approach. So there's sort of a checklist of things we're trying to do with every company, just about how it operates. That may not have been the reason we invested. The reason we invested is because we were trying to drive some external impact as well. Can I say just one more thing? And this may go to the measurement issue, and it may be some of what your question gets at, but it's certainly something that comes to my mind. I think one of the biggest challenges in this field is how to assure that the impact you have outlives your hold period, that you really get impact lock, that it becomes a matter of culture for the company. And in the case of a consumer brand, for example, it's the value add, it's the reason why it commands a premium in the marketplace. And I think we've done some work on that, but I think as a field, there's a lot more work to do.
That's such a good point. Impact lock. There's sort of a professor at Harvard Business School, Julie Batalana, that really looks at hybrid enterprises where you do have these clash of cultures, where you've got sort of the commercial side of the house and then the sort of the social impact side, and how they can get out of balance. And it was very interesting. In 1998, we invested in an extraordinary social entrepreneur, Vikram Akula, who founded SKS Microfinance, which was the first microcredit institution to go public on India Stock Exchange. And if you sort of follow follow the difficulties that that company had. And he intentionally started as a nonprofit till he figured out the model, until he figured out how to scale it, and then flipped to for-profit, and then took on a lot of private equity funding. But that's when the clash happened, and it ultimately caused a lot of agita in the company. So I think that impact and beyond. That's exactly right. Yep. So I think that's so important. Can I ask, say you've got some folks here who've got an incredible idea, and one day they take the train up to Boston, they come down to your office. What do you like to see in a pitch? Like, what works? Like, how do you tell these folks who've got aspirations for getting to the point where Bain Double Impact could make an investment? What needs to happen for them to sort of get across the finish line with you and your team?
Well, in our case, we're investing in cash flow positive companies. So they're companies that have already figured out how to get a net positive in their bottom line. My colleagues are a hybrid. They come from, there's 16 of us on our team. A bunch of them have transferred from other Bain Capital business units. Some have come from impact investing backgrounds. Others have come from regular way middle market PE firms. So there's a whole hodgepodge of approaches that we are busy trying to distill to a culture of our own. But most of them are experienced investors in one form or another, and they have lots of models they do, and lots of analytics they do, and all that's great, and it is important. But what I'm looking for is character and passion. I'm looking for whether someone is actually trying to solve a problem and bring a business approach to it, because I think that kind of grit. There's a whole thing that happens when you go from being this company to that company, and the best managers we've dealt with are the ones self-aware enough to realize they may not have all they need on their team or within themselves to take it to that level, but they want a partner who gets them. They don't want to just turn the keys over to somebody else.
I just think that's spot on. I love a couple of quotes. So to speak to your point, John Meacham, the historian, who says the character is destiny, and I just think that's so true in so many ways. And the longtime editor of Inc. magazine, George Gendron, used to say that entrepreneurship in its purest form is the transformation of human capital, imagination, grit, determination, passion into financial wealth. And again, just sort of that transformative process when you look across the table and you say, that's it. She's the one.
Well, there's another thing that I think is that relates to that, and it was something a term I heard in the worst of times in my old job when the economy was just taking its toll on everybody, and that's this notion of entrepreneurs of necessity. Yes. That there were people who had been so displaced by the economy, they were having to figure it out anew. They're having to reinvent themselves. And I think that there's a part of what you are doing in particular, and what you have modeled for others, which is democratizing entrepreneurship. That people have passion, and they want to turn that into cash, but they don't want to do it without the passion. Meaning they don't want to. They want to contribute. They want meaning alongside their wealth, and you have, as I said, mentored and sponsored, and through your organization, inspired lots of folks who may not have seen their path on the commercial side, but I'm glad they have, because we need that we need conscience in every sector.
And truer words have not been spoken, which of course is going to lead me to my next question to you. I was so chagrined. I remember it was a little over a year ago, and I read the Politico article when Governor was announced that you would not be running in the 2020 race, that you had decided not to run.
There are plenty of others.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Still time. That's right. That's right. See,
I see our time is up. Thank you all for coming.
No, we can't leave it. I mean, again, sort of having, men and women of character and commitment who go into public service for the right reasons. I sort of sit on the sidelines as a committed layperson who votes, does my civic duty, but would never sort of jump into that arena. Can you just talk about sort of the state of play, where we are? Have you thrown up your hands? Does it really all still matter? Enlighten us around this topic.
Did anybody see that on the? I actually think, what's that? Yeah, I actually think it's. I guess to paraphrase or to coin Dickens, it's the best of times and the worst of times. There was one truth that candidate Trump spoke during the 2016 election when he said that conventional or traditional politics weren't serving a whole lot of people very well. By the way, it's the same truth Bernie spoke. It's the same truth Barack Obama spoke in 2006 and 7, and it's still true. Forget about whether you believed that candidate was going to do anything about it. But what has happened, I think, is that a whole lot of folks who were on the sidelines came off the sidelines, realizing that in a democracy, we get the government we deserve. And if you sit it out, that's what we get. So I'm hopeful. I think I was active helping in the midterms, and I worked only with the candidates who were running in places. I'm a Democrat, by the way. I'm not the sort of Democrat who thinks you have to hate Republicans to be a good Democrat. But I am. I was working with candidates in places where Democrats hadn't been competing for a long time. 14 different races, and 10 of them won. Wow. And 3 lost by a hair, and 1 was only decided a couple weeks ago in North Carolina, and they're having a new election. So I think it's an exciting time where folks are, I think, more ready than we have been in a long time for big ideas, which is huge, and there is more interest in those ideas and in having a government, frankly, at any and all levels that is responsive to that and to all of the people who have felt unseen and unheard for way, way too long.
Far too long, yes. Well, I think that's a wonderful and hopeful note to end on. If you please join me in thanking Governor Deval Patrick.
Well, and in thanking Cheryl Dorsey.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.